Thank you very much for being here and welcome. This is an event that's part of the Center for International Development's Building State Capability program, which is a program that is being kind of initiated by myself, Lant Pritchard, and Michael Wilcock, who is here. Lant will be speaking this afternoon. Thanks to everybody at CID for helping to pull this off, to Marcelo Escobari, Adriano Ojos, Chuck McKinney, Andrea Carranza, Maria Tesla, and I hope I'm not leaving anybody out. And I don't think she's here, but thank you to Daria, my assistant, for organizing countless flights and hotel rooms and things like that. Even though the Red Sox are playing here tonight, we kind of managed to put everyone in a room. And I guess we should say go Sox, right? Most importantly, I want to just say thank you to all the presenters who are here today. We had a dinner last night, and this is this came from a discussion I had with Rohini Pandey a few months ago, where she said, you really should have an event to present your new book at the Kennedy School. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, I want an event where I say I have a new book that is no longer new and I'm tired of talking about it. And what I really would like is to get some people who have inspired me and influenced what is in the book and what I'm thinking beyond the book, and get them to talk about things that I'm interested in. So there's a lot of selfishness in the design of the workshop today. But I want to first and foremost say thank you to all the people who are on the agenda for all agreeing to talk so easily, and for making the time to fly from California, to come up from Princeton, and from all over the place to do this. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. The key message in my book is that many of the reforms that we do in development in the governance space are not delivering as much as we would like them to. It's not that they're failing, it's just that we think that they could do better. And the goal, a little bit of this workshop, is to think more on what does better look like, and how might we get there. So, this first session is going to be addressing the big question of kind of what is governance, and how do we assess it, and how do we think about it. We have Frank Fukuyama, who is from Stanford, and I think pretty much everybody knows who Frank is. He's an accomplished author, an accomplished social commentator, and a little while back he published a piece in the journal Governance titled, "What is Governance?" And there was a fair response to that, and so I thought it would be great to have Frank to come and discuss that. On the panel on the other side of me is Merilee Grindle, who is one of the people who really inspired the conversation about governance, I think about a decade ago, when she wrote a paper called Good Enough Governance. And I don't think that there's anything that is written about governance now that doesn't cite that paper. So it's a very interesting discussion, I think, that we're going to have about what is governance, how do you assess the quality of governance, and in particular, kind of how do you make governance something that is useful, and something that we think can be about functionality in governments and not just about what they look like. So how we're going to structure this first session is to have Professor Fukuyama will do his presentation, and then immediately after that we will have Professor Grindle, and then we will take questions from the floor. So thank you very much for being here, and let me stop talking.
Okay. How long do you want me to?
You can do.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much, Matt. It's really great to be here. A lot of my favorite people are in this room, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So I thought I would start with some general kind of conceptual ideas about what the subject that we're talking about is, and then focus in on the panel of this. The title of this panel is Governance with Impact, so I'm going to get to that, but I want to cover a little bit of theoretical ground first. So let me begin with a general observation. I'm a political scientist, and in my discipline, what I find rather interesting and troubling is that nobody wants to study the state anymore. People want to study democracy, they want to study ethnic conflict, they want to study voting behavior, all sorts of things, but to actually focus on the state, that is to say executive branches and their bureaucracies, is something that has been relatively understudied. And in particular, the focus on public administration that used to be at the core of the discipline has somehow disappeared. And actually, it's also related to this displacement of the word government by the word governance. So I learned this in this funny way. As Matt said, I published this little paper in the journal Governance with it, and I shouldn't have given it this title, but I kind of provoked this little hornet's nest by titling it "What is Governance?" Now, coming out of the kind of developing country public management World Bank world, I had for long thought that governance was actually just a euphemism for old-fashioned public administration. If you say the words public administration in any large audience, you immediately cause people to fall asleep. And and if you say the word governance, it has a sexier sound and seems more acceptable to people, and so forth. And one thing that I think is very clear is that actually the word governance has replaced government with a much more diffuse, a concept that is much more diffuse, and I think actually much less useful. And in fact, I would say that the word governance, as it's used by many people, is something like the provision of government-like services by anything that's other than governments. So they can be NGOs or corporations or labor unions or shadowy networks of people. And in fact, there's a kind of ideology that says that the proper focus of the study of governance ought to be on something different. I'll give you just one quotation from one person writing on this subject. Central government is no longer supreme. The political system is increasingly differentiated. We live in the centralist society, in the polycentric state characterized by multiple centers. Thus, the state becomes a collection of interorganizational networks made up of governmental and societal actors with no sovereign actor able to steer and regulate. There's a history to why this view of governance has appeared. Just as an empirical fact, it's true. These government-like services are in fact provided by many different organizations, particularly in poor developing countries. And so I'm not arguing with the empirical fact that the reality is as described. But I do think that it's unfortunate that this has also led to a displacement of the study of governance away from old-fashioned public administration that is done by states and by executive branches in states. I'm not going to get into this, but I think that actually the shift in emphasis to the provision of those services by organizations other than states is problematic in many cases, because if you outsource to other kinds of actors, you in a sense, displace the core functions of the state. It doesn't actually mean that you need a less capable state, because you need a regulatory state at least that can manage those other actors. But it also has the effect of infantilizing states, because they're now not actually in the business of doing their core functions. And so I think that the whole effort to bypass and downgrade the study of old-fashioned public administration is a mistake, and that we need to return some of the focus to that. So, if we then concentrate on the question of what we mean, or what it is that we want to study, I think that we need a much more precise definition. And here I'm going to get into my various complaints about the existing measures of what is good governance. So in my view, what we really need to return focus to is the implementation side of government. And by the way, this is part of a larger, I think, phenomenon in the public administration field, that in the United States, there has been, at one point, actually government supported the seeding of a lot of public administration schools around the country. And in many cases, I think including here at the Kennedy School, there's been this tendency to shift from old-fashioned public administration that focused on implementation to public policy. And there's lots of reasons why this is the case. First of all, part of it is just the dominance of economists, because their econometric techniques work much better in the study of public policy than they do in the study of public administration. And then there's just a prestige matter, that everybody would like to be the one that gives the orders or tells the government what orders to give, rather than the one that actually carries out the orders. And so, in the field in general, I think public administration has drifted to second and third tier schools. A lot of times it focuses just on state and local government, and as something that feeds into the actual implementation of high-level policy, it has not gotten terribly much attention. But I think that implementation side is important. In this audience, I don't have to make the case that state capacity is critical for development. I'm not going to go through that literature again, because everybody here in this room has contributed to it. And in the absence of our being able to build state capacity, I don't think that we're going to achieve any of the other objectives that we have in development, in health, education, security, and whatnot. And so I think that we need to focus on better measures and better conceptualization of what state capacity is. This is a kind of complicated issue, because in the end, it is not possible to separate implementation from the objectives that the state is carrying out. But I would just make the argument that for as much as we can to actually try to separate them. I'll just give you an example. The worldwide governance indicators, when you talk about regulatory quality, if you actually read, their definition of what that includes, it embeds certain policy preferences. For example, less regulation rather than more regulation. Now, in the case of the recent financial crisis, I don't think that was the right idea. I think that policy preference was actually a big mistake. And so if you're going to come up with a measure of governance that has substantive views of the ends, the proper ends of government, as opposed to trying to focus on implementation issues, it opens up. It's not that this is not an important issue. Of course it's an important issue as to what public policy is trying to accomplish. But if you open up this discussion of the measurement of the quality of government to include all of the substantive ends, then I think you've really lost focus on the question of what it is that the agents are going to be doing. The other important issue, I think, in our study of implementation is to separate implementation by states from the question of democracy, basically, from other aspects of government. Now, democracy is really important. Transparency and accountability, these euphemisms for freedom of the press and democratic accountability that we've gotten accustomed to using. They are intrinsic goods, they're ends in themselves, and I would be the last person to deny that. But I think that one of the really important intellectual tasks we have to set for ourselves is actually to ask what the relationship between democracy and good implementation is, because it's an empirical question. It's not one, I think, that we can just posit an answer to. And in fact, a lot of the prevailing orthodoxy in the practitioner community is that democracy and good governance are intimately linked, or they're two sides of the same coin. And so if you want to, for example, deal with a question like corruption in government, the solution to that is more transparency and more accountability. Now, I would say that that is a theory. It is a theory that is probably true in some cases, but it's not clear that that is something that's universally true. And the part of the world that really throws it into question actually is East Asia. When you go to countries like Singapore and China, where you actually have authoritarian governments that nonetheless are reasonably responsive to social concerns and pressures and so forth, and yet seem to be able to deliver basic public goods and services like water, electricity, public health, basic education, better than comparable democracies like India, I think that indicates that there is actually potentially a problematic relationship. And I think a lot of Merilee's work, her recent book on clientelism kind of indicates why that's a problem, because in fact, democratic political systems, I think, tend to recruit people or mobilize voters through clientelistic methods, and there's actually a good reason to think that there actually could be a negative causal relationship between democracy and the ability to provide good service. I mean, just watch what's going on now in India in terms of, the administration of different social programs, and I think you can see that that tension is really there. So we need, I think we need some better measures of just that implementation side, where we're focusing on public services that are pretty much universal. Every country needs to provide security, health, education, public goods, infrastructure, public financial management, and so forth. All right, so how do we then measure the quality on this implementation side? And I think that there are a lot of reasons to be dissatisfied with a lot of the existing measures. I want to give credit, the World Bank has done a lot of pioneering work in this. I think most of us would be at a complete loss if we didn't have, the CPIA or the worldwide governance indicators. But I think there are a lot of problematic aspects to this. First of all, a lot of these measures are not actually based on a theoretical concept of what good governance is, and so for that reason, they get a lot of things mixed up. I mentioned one of them already. I mean, the fact that actually the things that are probably meant to measure implementation are also embedding certain substantive public policy preferences in them. A lot of them are based on perception surveys, and here I think Matt's recent book is really a great example of how that produces a wrong bias. So Matt's work shows, for example, that when a developing country government introduces a much touted set of governance reforms, its governance scores by these perception indices improves. And then after a few years, it goes back to, the old mean of poor governance. And what that indicates, obviously, is that all of the foreign experts that are being asked their opinions about what the quality of governance is actually don't have any idea. They have no idea whatsoever. They don't know actually whether the government is really providing better services, whether it's operating more effectively, and whatnot. But they do know that there's been a reform, and so they say, yes, things are getting better. So I think prima facie, there's a lot of reason to be skeptical about some of the numbers that you see in things like the WGI. I find this particularly problematic in a case, in some of these Asian cases. So begin with the fact that you get one number for the whole of China, 1.3 billion people, and it's got one government effectiveness number. So anybody that knows China understands that there's huge variance internally, by sector, by geographical region, by level of government. So there are certain parts of the Chinese government that, I think function a lot better than Washington does. And then if you go down to, areas like food safety, terrible. Performance is absolutely atrocious. And so I think unless you have a set of quality indicators of governance that is much more granular than the ones that we have, you're just not going to say anything interesting. And a lot of the cross-country comparisons are going to be misleading. And I think, now every single one of us understands that every one of these things that we call countries is actually this big heterogeneous collection of very, very different, levels and types of functionality and so forth. And so we need better ways of assessing things divided, as I said, by sector. In fact, you could probably ideally you'd want to go down to an individual agency level, by sector, by geographical region, by level of government, and so forth. So I think that this is what's led me in my own research to launch a new project that will try to capture a little bit better some of these aspects of state capacity. So I just want to review with you, what a few of these could be. I am generally skeptical about using output measures as a proxy for state capacity for a variety of reasons. I know a lot of people do that, but the problem, I think, with using output measures, although in fact this is the reason that we want to have good government, is for the outputs of government, it just seems to me that raises a number of methodological problems that I'm really not sure how to solve. So for example, in education, I think most education specialists would agree that public inputs to education don't constitute more than, let's say, 30% of the variance in the actual outputs, and the rest is environmental, friends, family, level of development, and so forth. And so to actually separate out what's the public component of that factor or of that output is very difficult. It's a little bit easier in an area like health, but again, security, there's so many other areas where environmental factors pollute, output measures as a measure of government quality. And actually, it would be nice if you had a series of measures that could actually measure the inputs. What does the government actually provide in terms of state capacity, and compare it to outputs. And you could then actually do an empirical test to see whether our theories that say that a high-quality, merit-based Weberian bureaucracy should produce better outputs, whether that's empirically the case. We all assume that is true, but we actually don't know whether that's the fact in many specific cases. So if you want to measure the Weberian qualities of the state, there's lots of ways you can do it. You can count numbers of bureaucrats, you can count their educational levels, you can try to get measures of the degree to which people are promoted on the basis of a civil service examination, technical or educational criteria or so forth. There are a number of other basic government functions which are a little bit like outputs, but they're actually a little bit, I think, they're both inputs and outputs that I think would be useful. For example, the ability to register population and simply to know, where your population is and who individuals are. And by the way, I think if you did, this is more a measure for poor countries and rich countries, but even in the United States, although we have a decennial census, you're not allowed to actually use the census for anything other than redistricting. And if you actually ask, to what extent does the United States know who is on its territory and who citizens are, it's not that good, as I think the arguments over immigration reform would indicate. So that's another possible measure. I think a lot of the existing measures, like tax extraction, get you into all sorts of very deep methodological problems, because just to begin with, there's a really big difference between the potential tax extraction rate and the actual tax extraction rate that embeds a policy preference. So in wartime, America has raised its tax extraction rates to European welfare state levels, and it proves that we have the capacity to do that. But we actually choose to tax at a much lower level. And so what does it mean to say that, federal government takes 24% of GDP in the United States, whereas Germany's federal government takes 40%? That is a policy preference, and that's not a good measure of state capacity. Hillel Seufer has suggested some alternative measures, like the ratio of indirect to direct taxes, where the ability to extract income and personal property taxes is a measure of state capacity. That may work a little bit better in some cases, but again, there are hidden kind of historical institutionalist reasons why, for example, the Europeans use value-added taxes and we use income taxes, and it doesn't necessarily relate to the power, the actual extractive power of our government. So these are some ideas, but the main issue that I wanted to get to was one that I think almost nobody in this space has really dealt with, which has to do with measures of bureaucratic autonomy, which will then get me to the implementation problem. So let me just run through a couple of slides here. The question of bureaucratic autonomy, the appropriate degree of bureaucratic autonomy as a measure for the quality of government, it's funny because I think apart from people that study East Asia, this is not an issue that's been taken up big time in a lot of the governance literature. But people thinking about, why is it that East Asian countries like Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan could all run sophisticated industrial policies and not have those end up in a big, morass of rent-seeking and corruption, have pointed to the autonomy of the state as a central issue. And if it's true that bureaucratic autonomy is actually an important characteristic of strong governments, you then have to ask the question, is the policy community, by demanding greater rule-based decision-making on the part of developing country democracies, actually asking for the right thing? Because in the autonomy literature, what we are being told is it's actually the freedom from rules in, let's say, the economic planning ministries in Korea and Japan that allowed them to act independently of social, societal interest groups and pick industrial policies, to actually pick winners, but not have that process get politically corrupted. But on the other hand, in other circumstances, we're saying, well, the problem is the bureaucracy has too few rules. So Bob Klitgaard has this famous formula that corruption is equal to discretion minus accountability, and therefore the less discretion you have, the less corruption you'll have. But in some sense, if you think about the American government, that's not the case. I mean, I think, for a lot of American government, the problem is we don't have enough discretion. In federal procurement, you've got this monstrosity called the Federal Acquisitions Regulations, thousands of pages of rules that are precisely designed to prevent corruption in procurement, that make Defense Department purchases of, virtually anything 2 or 3 times as expensive as it should be otherwise. And so you've got this paradox that on the one hand, we're saying that decreased discretion is the route to getting to lower levels of corruption and better outcomes on the one hand in poor countries, whereas the big problem in other circumstances is too many rules and not enough discretion. So how do you square this circle? So I'm sorry, I can skip these slides. I would say that if you think about the question of autonomy, that there's probably this inverted U type of diagram that you can draw, where on the right side you've got high levels of autonomy, and towards the origin you've got less, and then in terms of the quality of outputs, you've got an inflection point that is somewhere in the middle, meaning that if bureaucratic agents are given complete autonomy, that's not a good situation. I mean, they are agents and they have to do what the political masters want. But on the other hand, if they have no autonomy at all, and if they are excessively bounded by rules, that's also not going to lead, it leads to, what people dislike about bureaucracies, which is excessive red tape. And so the question is, where does that inflection point lie? And I think that the overall solution to this question of how you judge where that inflection point is really has to do with the level of capacity measured in terms of, I would say, primarily the human capital available in a bureaucracy. so that you could draw several different curves depending on the level of capacity of the state. So capacity level number one would be, I don't know, Nigeria. I mean, some developing country with relatively weak capacity, where you would want more rules rather than less, simply because granting autonomy to, essentially a bunch of rent-seeking, poorly educated public officials is simply going to lead to a lot of corruption. Whereas if you have a very high capacity country like, I don't know, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, Japan, you actually would want more discretion, and you would want to bound them with fewer rules. Obviously, they also need to be bounded and they need to be held accountable. And I think that this, in some sense solves this paradox that I just mentioned about why is it that in many cases we're advising more discretion or less discretion, whereas in other cases what we actually want is increased discretion, and that really has to do with the underlying capacity of the state. And so I would say if you lined up all of those inflection points in that previous graph on a line, you get this upward sloping line of that. I mean, you always want more capacity rather than less, but you want to be somewhere on that line. You don't want to grant excessive autonomy in cases where the capacity isn't present. On the other hand, you don't want to overly constrain your agents in cases where the capacity is present, and I think that means that you can actually locate different countries in different places in this space. So just take the United States. It's interesting because if you think about the American government, we have certain parts of our bureaucracy that are unbelievably autonomous. Like you think about the Federal Reserve, I mean, in terms of the basic autonomy, its ability to pick, they basically pick winners in terms of bond buying and the like. There are complaints from their democratic masters that they've had too much autonomy. You got this big critique coming from people like Ron Paul that doesn't like the degree of autonomy, but by and large we've granted that. On the other hand, there are other parts of the American bureaucracy that are unbelievably slow and unresponsive as a result of excessive rules. And I would say, refer back to things like federal procurement and so forth. In a country like China, I think, again, you get this very wide spread. And so one of the impressive things, in a way, about Chinese government is that they actually oftentimes provide a better degree of autonomy to their local agents. And so they have contests among local government agencies for innovation, for different solutions. They do not punish innovation in a way that the American system tends to punish innovation. Look at Solyndra as an example. But on the other hand, there are other cases in which the party exerts dictatorial control and very much limits the kind of authority that is granted to different agents. And this then explains, I think, the overall policy direction that we are advising people. So Bob's formula is not wrong. In the case of a country like Nigeria, they need less discretion. They need more rules. They need, much better and much tighter accountability over the action of bureaucratic agents, as is the case in China at a much higher level of capacity. And so the type of rules that are needed in China, you need more rules and less discretion in the case of both China and Nigeria, but the level at which these changes in the level of discretion operate are very different. The Chinese have plenty of procurement rules. That's not their problem. What they need is more rule-bound behavior for the upper levels of policy making in terms of land rights and the ability of government to operate in an unaccountable way in terms of land seizures and so forth. Now, this brings me, I guess, to the final point about how to study this question of what is good governance and how do you improve government effectiveness, because it all has to do with, if you think about how do you determine the right level of autonomy, it all has to do with the interface between the political level and the administrative level. Woodrow Wilson, back in the 1880s, wrote this famous article on public administration in which he distinguished politics from administration, and he said, the study of administration is simply the study of the agents. It's a kind of technical study of how agents carry out the will of the, I mean, he didn't use the principal agent language, but that's basically what he was talking about. How do the agents technically carry out the wishes of their political masters? And you can't affect the political level, but you can turn the actual administrative part of it into a science. And what he was actually trying to do at that point was to raise the dignity of public administration and say, we don't do it well in the United States, high levels of patronage, and we need a professional bureaucracy, you know, that can actually do things on their own and actually act with greater autonomy. I think, however, that if you think this question through, it is really difficult to separate these two levels. And in fact, many of the administrative problems are tied directly to bad mandates coming from the political level. So the most obvious case of this is clientelism. What is clientelism? It's when a politician fills a bureaucracy with political appointees that are his or her followers. If you think about that, you can cast this in terms of bureaucratic autonomy. The bureaucracy has lost the autonomy to appoint its own cadres. It no longer controls its own HR function, and in a sense, that's one of the worst forms of political micromanagement that the political layer can impose. In developed countries, we've tended to get away from that sort of clientelism, but we have other forms of, of micromanagement. So we were saying just before this session started, if you look at our two big public policy innovations in the Obama administration, Dodd-Frank and Obamacare, the fact that you legislate these new policies isn't enough. The political fight is then carried on into the implementation phase, and actually all of the political people are now battling it out, either trying to block the implementation or to make it go forward, and there's no simple handoff of authority from the political level to the administrative level. So I guess just to wrap up, when you say, what is governance with impact? I think that what we all come to realize is that, yes, it is appropriate, or, okay, I don't know. I'm not speaking for all of us, I'm speaking just for myself. So in my view, yes, it's appropriate to focus on implementation, on old-fashioned public administration, but it is really hard, in the end to think about how to improve the quality of public administration without running into these political constraints and obstacles, right from the get-go. And so therefore, when you are studying how to fix an administrative problem, if you're not aware of those political constraints and the political stakeholders and what they are doing in terms of the mandates that they are issuing to public bureaucracies, you're not going to be able to figure out how to fix that problem. And so in terms of the study, it makes it very, very much context dependent because who those stakeholders are, what their interests are, how they see their interests, how they interact with other stakeholders and agents will vary from one case to another. So East Asia as a whole is very different, from Latin America, and within these regions things are different. And so without this kind of detailed local knowledge of context, you're really not going to make any headway. It means that I think universal, and this is again, in this audience is all preaching to the choir, but I think Matt's book does this very nicely, that you have to find some way, in terms of doing actual reform, you have to find some way to take that context into account. And I think he's got a very nice iterative methodology because you never understand that context adequately from the beginning. Just like you're probably not going to get a website for signing up, for Obamacare right the first time. And it's an iterative process where you have to go back at it and, and keep working the problem, incorporating, this kind of local knowledge into whatever your solution is. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Frank. I think a lot of food for thought, and let me see if I can make a graceful adjustment of the PowerPoints. Merilee, over to you.
So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be in a room with so many people who have done, I think, so much to advance new thinking about governance. I want to congratulate Matt on his new book, and for in that book and in his other work, stimulating thinking about new paths to governance reform, new paths to development. Frank, who has for me been a guide and inspiration for many years in terms of our work, we've never met before, and so it's just a real pleasure to sit at the same table with him and to hear him talk about the importance of the state and the importance of implementation. Here. I'd like to say, just focus my comments a bit on the set of activities, the set of discussions that have to do with improving governance. So a little bit about the concept of governance, but more how the thinking is changing and some of the dilemmas in research and practice that changing views about development are put forth for us. Some time ago, quite a long time ago, increasingly long ago, I argued that the concept of governance, and particularly its conflation with the notion of good governance, has been deeply normative in ways that I think hinder finding ways to make governance work better, and I think Frank has referred to that. This is just a compilation of many of the words that are used about what is governance. Many of them are characteristics, many of them are processes, others, as Frank suggested, are policy preferences. It is a list full of notions of what should be and how it ought to be. Characteristically, this bundle of good things has been what we've thought about, the kind of endpoints of what should characterize institutions and organizations. And these endpoints are based on known exemplars, sometimes the United States, but most frequently the Nordic countries. It seems to me that this has encouraged the kind of form above function in institutional reform that Matt Andrews has written about, and the expectation that by introducing new institutions of governance, a host of development problems will disappear. Inefficiencies, ineffectiveness, unresponsiveness, incompetence, corruption. Seems to me there's a variety of things wrong with this. I've tried to lay that out elsewhere. But one of the things that's wrong with it is that it leads to an increasingly long agenda of things that need to be fixed. And this is an old, from an old paper I did. I've never updated it, in part because the work to put it together is just so overwhelmingly boring that I've never wanted to go back to do it. But this does give you a sense that the things that need to be fixed tend to increase over time, and maybe the possibility that the longer you wait to fix them, the more things you're going to have to do. And this is particularly difficult, I think, for the poorer countries, the countries that have the farthest to go and the least capacity to make the kinds of changes. But I think, and this is just indicative, this is not meant to be definitive. I do think, though, that now, and thanks to Matt and others, there's some encouraging signs that this normative bias is being addressed, going beyond thinking about what is good and bad and thinking more about, well, what works in context. And currently, it seems to me, there's a focus in a lot of the development and governance literature on criticizing things like recipes, one size fits all, well, let's just get the policies right, or let's just get the institutions right, and then development will happen. If we have some universal standards, or let's identify best practices. And I think there's a sense in which this was an old approach to governance and to development, and that a kind of new set of thinking is emphasizing a focus on specific problems, much more understanding of the specific context of specific problems in specific countries, developing the idea of what is capacity, again within context, seeing development not as an end state, but as a long-term process that may in fact have numerous paths that unfold over time. There's discussion, well, let's take the next steps. What's good enough? Well, let's do some contextually sensitive diagnostics. Where are the bottlenecks? Let's address the bottlenecks. Or where are the binding constraints? Let's focus on that. So I do think that there is a process of moving towards a new way of thinking about how to improve governance, emphasizing the importance of knowing the context in which reformed policies and institutions, organizations, and processes are to be introduced, and designing interventions that are very appropriate to time, place, historical experience, and local capacity. So the idea of understanding the historical evolution of how countries muddle their way through to better performance, to relatively more efficient or relatively more effective institutions is tremendously important, and this notion of appreciating relative progress versus simply, establishing some ideal endpoint. So Matt, in some of his prior work, has argued that doing what seems possible is more likely to result in governance improvements than slavishly trying to do what the Nordics do. And if we really look at history, we find out that in fact the Nordics muddled their way through to improved governance over a long period of time, probably without a whole notion of what that endpoint was. So taking this history a little bit more seriously. But here's a question. How do we know that this new thinking in development or in governance is not just the latest fad in a field that is known for its faddish pursuit of solutions, the answer to development? And I wanted to just raise two questions that we need to be thinking about. First, although I personally believe that this new approach to development, to governance, and governance reform, context-specific, thinking of next steps, thinking of improvements and processes for getting to improvements is very appealing. I'm not sure that it is necessarily politically or bureaucratically or academically appealing. And by that, I mean it's pretty short on the vision thing. It's pretty short on the direction thing. So imagine a politician going out to the hustings and saying, well, citizens, let's take the next step. Let's muddle our way through to something that's better than what we have. Let's think about really doing some diagnostics here. We don't know what we're headed for, but let's just, kind of work our way towards it. Imagine citizens saying, oh yeah, okay, there's this logic of diminished expectations, and I'm going to vote for politicians who tell me that I can't have all the good things that I want right away. Imagine practitioners, the people in the bureaucracies or in the NGOs or in the donor communities, and what kind of guidance does this new approach provide for them? Does it, they need to know what to do when they go to the office every day. They know when people come to them and say, what's the answer? They need to have some kind of answer beyond, well, let's just try something and see how it works. Condoners really live with a problem-solving approach based possibly on muddling, which I think is the way history happens. But donors are under a great deal of pressure for results and for rigor in their approaches. Finally, we who study development, make names for ourselves by having big ideas and big overarching theories, and to come forward and say, well, there are lots of unique solutions to very specific contextual problems. Doesn't get you very far in the journal publishing world. So that's one set of issues. I couldn't help as I was thinking about this too. I was thinking about there was a time when I was addicted to the television program House. Do you know that? And until I realized that every week, somebody would come in and say, I have a headache, and they'd try something, and then they'd try something else, and they'd try something else. And each thing they try, the patient gets closer to death, until, they're bleeding at the ears, and, and they've lost their minds, and they've been operated on and lost many of their, basic organs and things like that, and then House comes in and says, oh no, it's something in the orange juice that you drink or something like that. But there is, I think, when we're thinking about next steps and identifying things, we have to realize that that it's problematic in terms of finding guidance of where to go. It relies a lot on smart people figuring out next steps. My second thing is that I think this is a kind of new way of thinking about reform, a new way of thinking about making changes in institutions. We've got lots of frameworks now that are being proposed. We've got Matt's very nice problem-driven approach. We've got diagnostics, but have we really looked to see whether these work in practice? I don't know that we've had enough time or enough experience to be able to say, yes, this really is a useful way of going. We need to ask, as Frank has asked, what metrics are appropriate at this point? What kind of objectives should we should we be thinking about? Is there good muddling and bad muddling? How do we think about the time dimension? if, next steps is the way to get improvement. Okay, just to return a bit to this normative theme, I am convinced that getting beyond the what ought to be is really important in development, and focusing in on specific interventions in specific contexts, problem solving in this next steps kind of way. And I'm hopeful that this can lead to new ways of approaching how to get better as opposed to how to get perfect. But I also want to emphasize that I think it's not problem-free. And for that, I think this may be an example, and I'll just try it out on you, of an example of trying the new, this new logic from my book about patronage in the public sector. When I talk about patronage in the public sector, I'm talking about a recruitment process where discretionary appointments for either political or personal objectives is the principal means of finding a non-elected job in government. So all countries have patronage jobs, but there are some countries in which a large part of the bureaucracy is in fact there because of discretionary appointment. Now, virtually everywhere in the developing world, and it's particularly true of the region of the world I know best, which is Latin America, the Weberian ideal of, is that where I am? Yes, the Weberian ideal of stability, regularity, legality, procedural accountability is emphasized as the way to make governments better, governance better. And patronage is universally decried as inefficient and corrupt. These are just words taken from the literature. The list could go on, but it's very clear there's a normative sense here. In development, Weberian bureaucracies have good characteristics, and patronage bureaucracies have bad characteristics. And in my book, I've tried to look at patronage systems with two questions in mind. The first is, if they're so bad, how come they've persisted so much in time? And secondly, what has been the process through which countries have moved from having patronage bureaucracies to having Weberian bureaucracies. And I take a broad historical approach to a number of countries. And when you look at it historically, there is a paradox that patronage systems have been key factors in what we would consider generating both good and very bad outcomes. So historically, think about many of the countries of Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even the US, the patronage systems were part of what created organized states, produced order and stability and efficiency in some states, that brought technical and professional expertise into government, that allowed organizational leaders to build more effective organizations, that built in accountability to political officials, helped consolidate some political parties, and made it possible to develop consensus within government about reforms. But along with that, there's a lot of evidence that patronage systems also generated lots of bad things. Corruption and incompetence and centralization of power and a spoils system and even violence around elections when the ins are fighting the outs because the stakes for having positions in government are so high. I got interested in this question because my earliest research was in Mexico. And Mexico, the old Mexico before 2000, was a beautiful case of a very finely constructed patronage system in the public sector that was an essential factor in promoting policy change and stability and accomplishing many of the modern activities of government. But it also contributed significantly to the maintenance of an unjust political system, and for 71 years, and encouraged corruption. It's still in place. I suspect it's still producing good things and bad things. So my point is that seeing this institution of patronage in its historical context is very different from an automatic assumption that these systems are bad in both normative and operational senses. It's a long and complex story, but I think we can find good evidence historically that patronage has been and can be used in very purposive ways by political and administrative elites to bring about positive changes in institutions, policies, and states. And I could give some examples. But in the end, though, the problem with patronage systems is not that they are inevitably corrupt or incompetent. It is that, I would argue, they are capricious, in the sense that they are so responsive to the objectives of those who control them, those who are making the appointments, that they often suffer when political and leadership changes occur. So that it's, once again, not that they are inevitably corrupt and incompetent, but that they can't be counted on to perform in predictable ways over long periods of time. But at the same time, it seems to me that the introduction of Weberian bureaucracies brings its own pathologies, as Frank has suggested. Excessive rigidity, inability to respond to new circumstances, unresponsiveness to citizens, preferences for rules over solutions to problems. And this is one of the major reasons that in developed countries, the discussion has moved towards the new public management. So the bad has become the Weberian bureaucracies, and the good has become something that goes under the rubric of the new public management. So at least in terms of thinking about patronage systems and Weberian systems over the long term, there's a trade-off that's made. Rather than a black and white story, there's a trade-off between flexibility and change on the one hand and stability and order on the other, and now we're moving back, I think, to a concern about flexibility and responsiveness with other approaches in developed countries. Let me just finish up. I think this raises continues to raise some normative problems, because the implication of this might be that a reformer might seek to use a patronage system in place, because that's part of the context, to bring about important changes in how services are delivered or how reforms are moving forward. But we also have a lot of evidence that patronage systems can produce great harms. So I think we continue to need to be aware of the consequences of the kinds of choices that we as people concerned about development, we who give advice are suggesting. So I just want to leave us with several questions that I think maybe don't have answers, yet, but are things we need to think about. We say context is important. Context is enormously complex, and it's not clear at all what you pick out of context to consider as important. And there's lots of frameworks, but people don't agree about what are the important things you need to focus in on. If you say this time and this place is tremendously important, okay, well, what about it? And so I think we need work there. If solutions to problems are unique, are there guiding principles that we can find for interventions? I'm not sure we have that yet. This idea of capacity and autonomy, I think, is a nice way of responding to that question. If solutions to problems are unique to context and time, how can we learn from experience? What are the metrics of success if we reject end states? And finally, just again, what are the normative issues that we need to face up to if we're saying, okay, let's take the next step, thinking about, what does that mean over a longer term period? So thank you very much.
I'm particularly encouraged by the fact that this is a great debate on something I'm really interested in. Sometimes I think people aren't interested in the things that I am, but it seems that there are enough people in the room. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that people have. There are people from all over the world. We actually have some people who flew in from Ghana for this event, and we thank you for coming. And we have people from the IADB, the IMF, the World Bank. We have some representative from the Swiss government, and then we also have Kennedy School students and staff and faculty. So I'd like to open this up for questions now. We'll take maybe 3 questions at a time. And if you could please introduce yourself, say what your name is, where you're from, and then please if you could ask a succinct question so we could get enough questions in and maybe have a couple of goes with this. We have a microphone, so I think that we are recording this. If you could step up to the microphone and maybe just stand in a line there, it's in the middle of the aisle right here. I think that would be really useful so that we make sure that we get a question on record. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Kirill Moladik. I'm Kennedy School's mid-career student, and I have a question to Professor Francis Fukuyama. Professor, I like a lot your theory about cycles of social disorders, and I would like to ask you: should the public policy be different in different points of cycles of social disorders? And should our evaluation of public policy should be different and depend on in which point of cycle we are now? Thank you.
Very good.
My name is Iyabo Basunjo. I'm an advanced leadership fellow at the university. My question is specific to Africa. I think the issue that Professor Fukuyama said about Asia in terms of being strong leadership leading to not democracy being the most effective is also panning out in Africa, in which you can see that some form of dictatorship leads to better governance and outcomes, and also democracy is being pushed so much. At the same time, it creates so much chaos. And what Professor Grindle said about the context, because in the elections become so difficult and so volatile because the stakes are so high, and where you don't have elections, things seem to work better. Also, I wanted to talk about Nigeria specifically. Sorry, I wasn't going to be so specific, but you mentioned Nigeria, and I think there was a misdiagnosis. I don't think the problem with Nigeria is capacity. It's as much capacity. If anybody, Nigerians in terms of Africa are some of the most, and I'm not saying that out of pride, I think most other Africans will agree with me. Most places you go, you find a Nigerian of a lot of capacity. I think Nigeria is more like an Indian problem. It is not capacity per se. The problems are there. The corruption is excessive, but I'm saying that I think the diagnosis is more of it's not really a capacity problem. There's definitely a problem in terms of the from your map, in terms of the anyway, the effectiveness. And so that was
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor, for this great debate. My name is Jason Zhang. I come from MPID, stands for International Development, second year in Kennedy School. And as a Chinese, I was always amazed by how much China has been able to achieve, like in the past 30 years. So I was so of this idea of results is the most important thing. But I'm also interested in those European and also US histories. So I think the process also matters. I was also amazed by how well known and how beautiful those institutions has been built in those nomadic countries. So my question is to Professor Andrew Matt. So how can we reconcile these two very different ideologies? One is focused on the results, while the other is focused on the process. And what are the efforts that we can do to bring these two different sides together on the same table? As Professor Melissa mentioned, that this is her first time to sit on this table with Professor Fukuyama, even though Fukuyama is in his 60s, if I may mention that.
Why don't
Sure, I'm
we
older
stop?
than he
Yeah,
is.
why don't we stop at that point? And you know, while we're talking about age, the MPIDs invited me to play soccer with them this weekend because they were playing against the other programs. And then when I arrived there, they put me onto the other teams, and then they beat the other team. And I thought, these guys really are rational thinkers, right? Let's take these three questions, and maybe we can start with Professor Fukuyama.
Okay, on the question of cycles of social disorder and should public policy change, well, yes, I think, definitely. I think that, social disorder is one of those contextual features that will affect the outcome of public policy initiatives. And if you don't take that into account, you're not going to get things right. So just with reference to the United States, you think about something like public security. We had this big, rise in violent crime that began in the late 70s and has kind of finally, it began to really taper off seriously sometime in the mid-1990s. Part of the reason it tapered off was better public policies because there was, more incarceration and different approaches to policing and so forth. But a large reason that it tapered off was just the baby boom, aged and social conditions changed, and mostly young men that create crime, but now they're all in their 50s, and like me, in their 60s, and they're not knocking over 7-Elevens anymore. And so that obviously affects the nature of policing and the kinds of solutions that are available. On the question of Africa, that's an interesting question. I think that when people talk about strong African leadership leading to good outcomes, you're basically talking about Ethiopia and Rwanda. I mean, you're talking about Meles Zenawi and Paul Kagame, and it's true that they've racked up pretty impressive records. I would say, though, that one of the big mistakes in thinking about this is to just take those isolated cases as evidence of authoritarian government performance per se, because for every Kagame and Zenawi in Africa, you've got all the Angolas and Nigerias and Nigeria's, I guess it's a democracy, but it didn't do well under military government. I mean, but there are plenty of authoritarian governments in sub-Saharan Africa that have pretty miserable records. And the big question for authoritarian modernization is, where do you get your supply of good authoritarians? If everybody could have a Lee Kuan Yew, we'd all be doing pretty well. And the thing about East Asia is, I think that there is something in this general Confucian cultural heritage where many Chinese, countries within the Chinese cultural orbit started out with pretty strong government, strong national identity, a lot of advantages in the pre-modern period that got disrupted as a result of colonialism, but have now sprung back, to life. And that's just a fact of life that exists in that region and is not the case in other parts of the world. And as to the question of why I'm in my 60s and haven't met Merilee yet, I don't know what the answer to that is, but
It's inevitable.
Merilee, do you want to?
No, you go ahead.
So, Jason asked me about how do we kind of think about the results versus ideologies. I think it gets a little bit to what Merilee was speaking about. I think it's really difficult because I think, when you can't specify what the results are, and even, the discussion of how would we measure this, it's really difficult, and I think then we do jump to ideologies because we need something. And, I almost think it's like, of all the great religious stories, the person I feel the most sorry for is Moses, because Moses had these incredible events where he met with God, and then he went down to the people and they said, what did God say? And he said, well, we've got to carry on following that cloud over there. And I kind of feel that, it's a little bit, we know we're going somewhere, but we're not really sure where it is, and we may get results, but we don't know what they are, but we know that there's something that we know a general direction, and unfortunately that doesn't kind of work a lot of the time. So I think it behooves us on this side of the table, perhaps thinking about this, to think about how do we think cleverly about this issue of progress. And what would it look like in specific countries if we thought that your capacity was growing and state capability were expanding, and how might you measure that in contextual ways that people cared about? And that's the way that I think you get past ideology. So I actually think that you're going to have different metrics for different places. And you have to get into the political dialogue about what it is that politicians care about. But let's take the next set of questions.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rob Wilkinson. I'm a lecturer at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. A quick comment and a question. My comment is to Merilee Grindle. I used to work for many years for DFID, the British donor agency, and Merilee and others would always come in and help us understand our misconceptions about governance and how to rethink the way that we went about our business, which was hugely helpful, particularly that last point on blending the sort of positive and negative aspects of some of the countries we've dubbed as failed states. Are we oversimplistic in that? Which leads me to my question. Another one of the people was Mushtaq Khan, who would always come in, who would always force us to think about the benefits of corruption, of the positive impacts that some elements of some types of corruption would have in leading us to that upper right-hand quadrant where you had the high capacity and the ability for autonomy. How you get there was the big question, and corruption played a role in a good way in how you got there. And I was wondering, for Professor Fukuyama, if that element was captured in that, I think, wonderful four-quadrant diagram with low, high capacity, autonomy, and accountability, to have some part on the graph represent, is it incorporated within that measure that some kinds of corruption are desirable, even if we can't always publicly say that as a donor agency? Thank you.
Good luck with that one, Frank. I'm Bob Klitgard from Claremont Graduate University. I have a suggestion for both of you. Wonder what you think of it. I'm imagining we have progress on the two issues that you've brought up, and I'll characterize them this way. First one is we have a very vague concept that we have many different conceptual components to, governance now, and we need measures to try to get somewhere. Is this like other problems that we're familiar with in the social sciences and in life? Is this like GDP? Is this like IQ? Is this like the big five personality factors, etc.? Are there other areas of social science where we have striven to measure inevitably latent variables, inevitably value-loaded variables like intelligence or sustainability is a new one people are working on now? Can we learn from what has gone on in the construction of omnibus measures with imperfect data to make this an empirical question where it turns out if it's 71% of the variance is explained by this factor, we think one thing. If it's only 20%, we think another thing. And then think about that separately from the granularity issue, or what's the right level of aggregation? Is it the mean for a country? Is it the mean for a region? Is it a functional mean in a particular agency? Is it a particular hospital? And all those things may be useful. So I think the lesson from the aggregation literature is that there are many levels of utility of measures. There are utilities to national measures, and there are great utilities to other kinds of measures, plausibly. I mean, this is an empirical question. So I urge those, a lot of students here, great dissertation topic. What can we learn from psychology and other fields about this general problem? And those of you who are interested in statistics, it's a great statistics problem. Now, Merilee's last slide has another chronic issue, which is individuals differ, countries differ, companies differ, ... in their objectives, capabilities, and so forth. Therefore, how do we judge effectiveness? how would we give any advice to a different individual trying to learn, or a person trying to improve her health, or a company trying to become more profitable, or more whatever they're trying to do? And can we learn then from other areas where this inextricable question of individuals vary, and yet there are principles that cut across, have hit the coalface in reality, such as education, such as psychiatry, such as improvement of health? And I think business administration for both of you is an interesting case to look at, where it might provide useful guidance in overcoming these first-order conceptual problems you're really raising. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Matt Devlin. I'm a joint student here and at Yale Law School. My question is for anyone on the panel who'd care to address it. Professor Fukuyama had his graph, of course, where you had bureaucratic autonomy against capacity, and there was this ideal upward slope. And presumably that makes sense. You would want, say, if we disaggregate the state, you would want something like China with the National Development Reform Commission somewhere to the top and to the right, and say a sub-district of Yunnan to the bottom and to the left to match that out. And that makes sense to me in a state like China with some type of predictability and regime. You can set accountability and autonomy long-term. You can legislate for that because you kind of have an idea of what capacity you're going to be seeing in 5-10 years. So I wonder if that changes when you have a more flexible regime. For example, a historical example would be Latin America with these power-sharing pacts. You're going back and forth, and you're not sure what kind of capacity you're going to bring in. In that case, do we want a more vertical situation rather than a slope?
Let's take the last question, and then we'll get answers to that, and then it'll close the session. Nick?
Thanks, Matt. I'm Nick Manning, Head of Governance and Public Sector Management at the World Bank. You notice, Frank, in the title there, how we're very carefully straddling the divide there. Just two questions. First, I mean, on the point about the move away from working on government to working on governance, and the retreat from public administration, to some degree, haven't we created that rod for our own back by the persistent drumbeat of announcing our own failure over the last 20 years? In a way, it's a bit rich for us now to be sort of saying that it's a real problem that we're not focusing on this, when we've made it our theme. It's been our theme song for years, that we're hopeless at what you're paying us to do. So in a way, we have to sort of change the refrain a little bit if we want to sort of to change that dynamic. So that's the first question. The second is on the metrics, and both of you have sort of emphasised the significance of this, and it's obviously, I mean, sort of I very much take the earlier point that was made sort of about the level of aggregation, etc. But clearly, there's something really crucial there that has to be done. I mean, how would we know what it is we're achieving? And again, very much take your point, Frank, about we're talking about sort of metrics of institutional strength in some way rather than metrics of output. The problems that we're up against there, they're not only conceptual, I mean, they're also sort of, as I think Merilee was highlighting, I mean, they're political, they're sort of, there's all sorts of problems in terms of the supply side of the industry being so strong, right, that in a way nobody really wants to know the answer, right? What we want to know is how much of something or other we're pushing. We don't really want to know what it was that it led to. There's an interesting subtext here. I don't know whether any of you follow the OECD Government at a Glance, which I launched while I was at the OECD. This was initially meant to be exactly the sort of work that you were describing. How do we begin to look at the relationship between the institutional arrangements and what we know about output or efficiency? And what it's become, because of pressure from countries, is a brochure about what it is that OECD countries are doing. Right? That persistent political pressure is really, really strong. So given that, right, and given also just a recent experience that we had where we did a big data exercise to look at everything we knew on the institutional side in the Middle East and North Africa, and how could we relate that to anything on the output side? If we just mushed it all together, was there something in there? And the answer was that there wasn't, because our data collection exercises were so boutique, so vanity-driven, so one-off, that none of them added up in any way. So my question here is, what would it take to drive us towards a more coherent collective action on the metric side? We all keep saying it's really important, but the actual progress is happening in, it's isolated, it's individual, it's in one-off papers, it's not adding up to anything. We're really, really, beyond bemoaning the fact, we're not actually making any progress on that.
Very good. Thank you. I think there's a lot of questions about when is corruption good, Bob's questions about kind of what can we learn and how do we evaluate things, the influence of different regime types on governance structures, and then I think, next question is, can we have a new refrain, and what about new metrics? And maybe I'll turn to Merilee first and see what, these are tough questions.
Very tough questions, and they've all been, subject of great deal of discussion, and I certainly don't have solutions to it. Just on, on the issue of metrics and how you know whether you're making progress in governance or not, I have to say as a footnote, I have major problems with measuring things, and most of my work is about telling stories and what you can generate from telling stories. So this is an uncomfortable area for me. But it seems to me if we are moving towards a kind of a sense of making things better, a kind of step-by-step approach based on, specifying problems and then thinking about next steps, that has real implications for what we learn. It has real implications for why we would need overarching metrics that compare countries. If, in fact, we're not saying you should do what Sweden did. We're no longer saying that. So what does it mean that Sweden's up here and Honduras is down here? So I think that's a really important question. It does seem to me that it's important for international competition to have metrics. It's important for us to continue these debates about what you measure and why you measure and how you know you're measuring something that's important. At the end of the day, I come away thinking that what we learn is really embedded more in the stories about bringing about change. That is, the principles we come up with may be more about how you approach problems, how you approach problem solving, how you approach the issue of implementation, and what that leads to as opposed to a score. But this is absolutely not an area that I'm comfortable with. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, on the question of whether some kinds of corruption are actually functional, I think, as Merilee suggested, the answer to that is yes. This book, Violence and Social Orders, that Doug North and Barry Weingast and John Wallace wrote a few years ago, I think sets a kind of theoretical model for why that's the case, where actually the sharing of rents among elites is a way of producing social peace. And that's actually the way I interpret a lot of Nigerian politics, is that you've got this very ethnically divided country, and one of the ways that you can keep people happy is by sharing, the resource rents that, every time someone threatens with violence, you send more money in that direction. And it's not a great system in developmental respects, but it actually functions as a way of, of buying political peace. And there are other, in the United States in the 19th century, the United States was the fastest growing country in the world in the late 19th century, and it had a thoroughly clientelistic political system. And so obviously there's not a necessary connection between our current understanding of good governance and economic growth. So, yeah, Bob, maybe I can talk about the methodological issues. So you're absolutely right that the aggregation is really useful, and actually these national rankings do serve as incentives to countries to, get their performance better. But one of the things that I find really striking is that if you look at the reform process historically in already developed countries and successes that have taken place in developing countries, they're usually they begin with certain islands of excellence. And so actually public financial management, central banks, and finance ministries in Latin America are really high quality right now. Education and, court systems are pretty poor. But, there are certain places where reform happens. And so I think you need to be able to capture that within country variance, and then be able to focus on expanding these areas where you actually have high quality administration. And I guess Matt Devlin, that kind of gets to that point, that there's always capacity. There's actually a book that's going to be coming out next year, edited by a guy named Michael Roll at Wisconsin, where he actually talks about these pockets of excellence in Nigeria, that there are agencies within Nigeria that are pretty good and have capacity. And so I think that framework actually works everywhere. I don't think it's something that only applies to highly developed countries, because you got to take account of that within country variance.
Great. Well, I know that there are students who have to get to class, because I know that I have to get to class. I want to say thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to everybody for great questions and I think an inspired conversation that I hope we carry on in other forums in the future. So thank you very much.